Love
How's
to
this
see
lighting situation? Better? Don't look like a freaking criminal with the eyes black?
it.
Dude, every time it's different. I love the fact that I make fun of everyone for their face getting red, but as a bald guy, you can see it even more. I look like, I mean, I was out in the sun a little bit today, but not for very long. We did a few sprints outside today.
Good. Better not hear about that knee later.
No, not me.
Uh-oh.
I was coaching them. Now,
All
I'm
right.
not ready to run yet. I'm not ready to run. I'm taking my time. I'm listening to my physical therapist. He's very good, by the way, folks. He's very good. We have him on tonight. I'll do my little introduction here, and then we'll get cruising along. Welcome to the Coach Haas podcast, sponsored by Sports Rehab PA. I think we're all pretty much geared
All
up.
rocking it today.
Yeah, well, it's working. And I have my sidekick. I can't call my sidekick. He knows way more than I do, so he's not the sidekick. He's Dr. Mike St. George. And how you doing there, Mike?
Good, man. How's it going?
Doing well. We got a guest tonight, Mike.
Yeah, let's introduce the guest.
Yeah, he's a student at Temple, and I'll let him kind of tell you a little bit more about himself. He's been coming into the gym, and we've talked often about some of the injuries and obviously the ACLs and what I'm doing with the kids here. And he posed a couple questions, and I was like, dude, let's get you on the podcast tonight. He's like, all right, bet. So here we are. Ryan, let's hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, just thank you guys in advance for having me on. I actually really appreciate it. Yeah, as Joe had mentioned, I'm a student at Temple currently. I'm a third-year physical therapy student. I have a background in kinesiology. I graduated from Temple in 2018, and I started my PT degree that summer in June, and so I've been going strong ever since. I played sports when I was younger, so I've always had an interest and a passion for them. And you combine that with an interest of mine in the rehabilitative field, and it kind of has created an avenue for me to pursue in terms of a profession, I guess. Some relationship in sports rehab, and that's kind of how I was able to segue into working with you a little bit, seeing what you were doing, and I actually really enjoyed my time that I got the chance to work with you, and that kind of segued the relationship that we.
Yeah, last summer you came in and shadowed me for a little bit. That was.
Yep, exactly, and created kind of the relationship that we have together. So it's I guess kind of built up from there. But as you mentioned, yeah, just a student currently.
Michael, the young lad here, has proposed some questions that I thought. I would love to hear Michael's end of it, because a lot of it has to do with the ankle and running, and Michael's our expert over here with that. Did you run cross country, track? What did you do?
Yeah, so I actually was a state level runner for New Jersey. I actually played soccer growing up, like soccer. I played like all, street sports and stuff. Never really got into like the ice hockey or any like the snow sports. None of my friends, anyone around. I mean, I grew up in Central Jersey, so, those sports weren't as popular. So we did a lot of street stuff. So it was like soccer, street hockey, like roller hockey, just backyard football, basketball. Did a little bit of everything. Gravitated mostly to soccer. And then just judging by the speed I had, I kind of went into track, and I started training for that. So I started going to the track with my father, and he had me just running, just getting endurance up. And I was able to just find out I was able to run. So like 8th grade, I was able to hit a 5:20 mile. And so I was able to be the top miler there.
Wow.
And then going in freshman year, I was able to hit like in the 440s. So then as the career went from there, from just running.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's funny because I look back now, and there was no rhyme or reason to any type of training that we did to facilitate running. And it's like, if I would have known the stuff I know now, I know I definitely could have enhanced what I did, as well as our team. We did
coach kind of coach you through that a little bit better. I mean, I'm sure the track coaches then were just like, just run.
Yeah. I mean, he was good with the programming and understanding about the running and the volume, but there was no talk about strength and conditioning to get better. I did 3 seasons. I did cross country, indoor, and spring, and you thought that's what you had to do.
Yep.
And it was more than just about getting varsity letters and all that. You thought that indoor track was kind of keep you conditioned for spring, but probably would have been more beneficial to spend that winter in the weight room and, just cutting back a little bit on mileage, because we did a preseason anyway before. I mean, we would go out springtime. We would start like at the tail end of March, windy. We start hitting 10-mile runs. And then the worst workout, even to this day, it's horrible. We would do like 16 quarters. So 400-meter runs, 65 or below was your target, 60-second rest. And you kept going to the point where the lines were looking like they were colors, And that's what we did, And it's like I look at the runners, I look at the kids now, and I'm just like, we did that, the consistent training of the same thing over and over again. And there was no implementation of, like, stability stuff. And it's like, man, like, who knows if I could have gotten myself a little faster. I never had any injuries, thankfully. But what was funny was my coach did always yell at us, get on the balls of your feet. And he was hoping that we would kind of pick up on that, because he didn't have the credentials or the ability to train us with that mid-foot strike, because God forbid, started getting some injuries, the Achilles and stuff that happens. I don't think he was really had the knowledge or the background to deal with that.
Right.
Hope that maybe we'd naturally get it. And I never did that. I just ran. And it's like, if I could have gotten in that form, who knows where it could have been. So just interesting when you look back at it,
Yeah. Ryan had an interesting question about this. So, Ryan, I want to let you fire away at the doctor here.
Sure.
Listen in, and I'll kind of see if I can get some questions from it. But go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So the background of this whole thing, where this question kind of came about, was this year I was able to attend the combined sections meeting, which Mike is I'm sure you're familiar, but for those that aren't, it's essentially just a large conference that a bunch of physical therapists and students go to, and they pretty much just present on what's current in research, topics that are relevant, and treatment styles from there. But there was one that I had the pleasure to attend that was given on running, jumping, and cutting, and the relationship that had with lower extremity injury. And one main point that kind of came from that presentation and started to create this idea in my head was the idea of, if you sacrifice mobility for stability at a joint that's supposed to be mobile, right? So we can think of, like, especially in the lower extremity, the hip or the ankle, that could in theory create an alteration in biomechanical output at the knee, which inherently causes a joint that's not supposed to be too mobile to actually become so. And so just kind of go over what they had illustrated from there. If they're speaking between the hip and the ankle, you can look at the ankle first specifically. A decrease in dorsiflexion means you won't flex the knee as much, which creates a kind of negative cascade, if you will, up the kinetic chain, where you're going to move further into hip adduction, and then to compensate, your hip adductors fire, which moves you into an increased position of the dynamic knee valgus, which I don't know if you guys have kind of alluded to before, but it's a faulty pattern that creates excessive stress on some of the soft tissue at your knee. The same thought process would follow for the hip, right? If you fall into excessive hip adduction and internal rotation, so your legs essentially coming in, that creates the same faulty pattern at the knee, and you get this period of dynamic knee valgus, which again just illustrates the fact that proximal or distal, issues create symptoms at the knee. So the knee might not actually be the culprit. It could be from a location elsewhere. And I thought that was pretty interesting. It was the first indication that I've really received that you really need to focus biomechanically on the entire kinetic chain in terms of its influence at each respective segment. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stefania Bell. She's the woman that's on Fantasy Football Now on Sundays with Matthew Berry. She's actually a really, really good physical therapist, and she was one of the presenters. And I guess in true ESPN fashion, she started talking about, to kind of wrap up this entire presentation, about Zion Williamson, because I'm sure, as you guys remember, he did just come off of rehabbing a knee injury, and at the time he was actually still injured when the presentation was being given. Right. And she was going through like an actual biomechanical analysis, in video while he was playing, and she was breaking down, his motion at differing segments during the video. And it dawned on me at first, as a former basketball player, I'm aware that in terms of footwear, the point of basketball sneakers inherently is to reduce range of motion at the ankle so you increase stability, right? Because lateral ankle sprains, functional ankle instability are an issue in basketball. It's just not too much of a surprise. It requires a high degree of cutting. It's repetitive jumping, which is going to at times induce extra stress on your ankle. So the point would be to create extra stability there. But is that actually creating kind of a paradox is where my first question was led to. Are you creating stability at the ankle and then losing that stability at the knee, which in its inherent function is actually supposed to remain stabilized, creating more mobility, albeit faulty, and now accruing extra stress on the knee joint itself? And so I kind of sat on that question for a long time. And I was actually thinking about writing a little bit about it recently, but I didn't get the chance to, I guess, the last few months. But I recently came across an article that's the first indicator that might actually answer the question a little bit. And the article itself talks about the relationship between knee biomechanical output and the use of ankle prophylactics. And that would include bracing, taping, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, it's actually the first thing that I've seen that would directly indicate a study that looks at if you're restricting joint motion at the ankle, the way that it would influence the knee. And so, if you guys wouldn't mind, I can give you the quick Spark Notes kind of synopsis from the article. And I guess the primary quick hitting points, and I guess I can give a shameless plug to my Twitter page I was telling you about earlier, Joe. It's
here we go. Throw a plug. Look at the mic.
Sure.
Plugs.
It's actually at PT_tags is my Twitter, and I kind of use it just to put out interesting information I'd find. And this was one of the ones that I did, and it, like I said, it kind of just springboarded this entire idea here. And just to like I said, just give some quick hitting points. It's spoke about ankle prophylactics, in particular braces, and their primary goal would be to reduce joint inversion or eversion, which is moving your ankle in and out. And they quite literally accomplished it. So one of the things that I mentioned is that you actually can decrease inversion in particular about 5 to 8 degrees during single leg cutting, which is primarily what they analyzed. And that's, that actually can decrease or reduce ankle sprains by upwards of 70%, which I think that the three of us could, as we, talk about this, could agree that's inherently a positive, right?
Sure.
The problem with especially braces in particular is that they have been found to inhibit or alter ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, which, as I kind of alluded to throughout that little quick synopsis of the presentation at CSM, that alters kinetic chain output much, like I said, much to what I explained earlier. And if that is the case, right? So if you decrease ankle plantar flexion or dorsiflexion, now you're increasing knee abduction. And so another quick note, if you increase knee abduction, by values as low as 2 degrees, actually, that tends to, incur or increase knee soft tissue injury, which of course the ACL will be included in, substantially from there. And so understanding this, like I said, the primary goal of the study was to analyze what these braces would do on entire kinetic chain output. They found that in females in particular, in those that were wearing a restrictive ankle brace, they actually increased peak knee abduction anywhere from about 3 to 5 degrees, which again provides kind of a legitimate source of information to what I had mentioned earlier. For people that might hear that, you could go ahead and you could say, well, you're cherry picking information, which I guess is to an extent is correct. And if you were to look at it, they actually didn't find any differences between the male population, but the female did. So the male population, there wasn't much of a difference in terms of the way that it would impact the knee. But again, in the female population, it did increase the risk of injury. I think that we can all agree too that in that population, they're naturally a bit more at risk. I'm sure as you work with any of your athletes, you'd notice that as they kind of, perform
about 80%
tasks,
female, probably 85% female. Yep.
Yep. Exactly. And you'll probably find that a lot of them have a tendency to collapse into this position regardless, right? So maybe your first thought process would be a potential indicator for the difference in sexes would be, well, females are naturally occurring in that position regardless. So potentially for some of those that they found to increase that, peak knee abduction force or moment, I guess, maybe it could be a result of just the natural, I guess, faulty movement pattern that is, typical to be seen amongst the female population regardless. But where I would be hesitant to agree with that is something else that they had mentioned, where they talked about the different groups that they had measured. So there were 4 primary groups. There was the restrictive ankle bracing group. There was the taping group. There was a control group, so people that didn't receive any sort of intervention at their ankle. And there was also what they called a novel ankle prophylactic group, wearing what they call the ankle roll guard. Now, I can tell you genuinely that last night was the first time, as I was reading this, that I had actually had the opportunity to be exposed to what this is. And so I guess I'll get to that in a second. But if you look at these 4 groups, amongst the females, specifically, those that were wearing the restrictive ankle braces, they still did prove to show that they decreased ankle range of motion, which is, again, the goal, but they did increase this faulty, movement pattern at the knee. However, in these novel ankle prophylactics, this, ankle roll guard group, for both, it was found for males and for females. The way that it's kind of the way I could illustrate this for you to understand, the way that it's wrapped around is it's not in the same kind of I guess, orientation that's wrapped around your ankle that you would, picture a typical ankle brace, but it actually kind of wraps around your shoe, and its primary purpose is to prevent excessive inversion. And they did find, by measuring, range of motion at the ankle during the task, it did prevent inversion, but you don't lose that mobility in terms of plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, which we've now kind of established originally does create a bit of a faulty movement pattern at the knee.
Right.
So by creating freedom in plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, specifically in this ARG group, they, and I say they as in both sexes, all groups included, didn't actually show any of these faulty knee biomechanical output patterns that were found in, the group that had the restrictive ankle brace, more specifically with females. So, I'm curious to hear your opinions on it.
Mike, what do you do with brace? What's your take on bracing and taping and?
So I would only use bracing or taping if you're trying to do a couple things. So if you're trying to, first of all, you want to protect a certain movement because something is healing. So if you listen to what some of the people who work with high-end athletes, pro level, or even in college, and they have to participate in game time. So you can even take an NFL lineman, for instance, they could wrap that ankle and allow to protect it in a range that they could function without compromising what is trying to heal. Also, they wrap it to basically stabilize that joint. So, if you're having a deficiency, maybe there's a motor control issue or something's going on, you brace that ankle to kind of act as a support. So you're going to help take load off of that joint while things are healing. So this way they're able to play, but they're using that. So maybe you're taping them and it's taking like 50% load off the joint because the tape is doing the work instead of the muscle. So until they get better, the tape acts there. And they can still play. But, yeah, you're going to compromise some of the mobility, but it still allows them to do certain things,
Right.
Even if you want them to have, limited play. Everyone always usually comes in and asks about the braces and all that type of stuff. Genetically, the human body is obviously meant to perform, without having all these type of aids. If you look at the history of the shoe, you could go and you could read an article that Irene Davis broke down in JOSPT, which shows about the history of the shoe, and really where we kind of got big. And you can even listen to Chris McDougall talk on a podcast as well, where he talks about the shoes. Obviously, he doesn't like Nike, but he talks about the evolution of that shoe, and basically it came to the point where we started putting these big mattresses under our feet and supporting. And what is this really doing here? I was did that in high school. I ran in bulky shoes and it made no sense because then you ran in track spikes.
Right.
Why would you train with a mattress under your foot and then go and compete in spikes? And it always felt better to me to be in those spikes. I felt faster, lighter, more in tune with the ground. There's a drill that one of the Spartan coaches that I train under does. His name is Yancey Colt. Joe's a little familiar with his name now. He does a great drill. He puts people barefoot or in their socks, puts them on a pavement and tells them to run. they will naturally not strike their heel, because if you do, you're going to jack yourself up. So you're naturally going to midfoot strike. So he does that to kind of get the point across. Now, that's not a good way to train. What he actually advises is to go onto like a soft surface, like a field on the soft grass, and go and run barefoot and feel the ground and get those muscles working.
About that, yeah.
So,
very interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
yeah, a big thing that Joe and I are seeing in all these soccer players is their feet are just destroyed. They're like these clubbed blocks that just don't move. They're in these horrible, cleats. They're on basically a platform with little nubs on the bottom, and they play in that, and they come home after the game. These kids are not stretching, they're not foam rolling, not even putting a lacrosse ball under their foot and rolling it out because they don't know any better. It's just soccer, 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 soccer.
And I go home, take my shoes off, I go right over to one of my little balls, and I just roll the bottom of my foot because it's been in a sneaker all day. I try to go much more barefoot or in a sock at home than I used to. I used to walk around in sneakers all the time.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, there's a lot more shoe brands coming out now that have more of a minimal style, but there are some that have a little bit more of a cushion, but they're still minimal in regards, because some people just can't, their foot genetically, whatever, maybe they have a little bit more of a rigid foot and they can't get away with as much as the support, or some people even have like flatter feet and they're really good as long as they have good muscular control. So I know it's like a big inclination that when some of these physicians too see it's just brace, 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 and that's not always the case. It needs to be done. The shoe is really the last thing that I'll change with somebody. I will improve the biomechanics and improve all the motor control first, and then see how they do. Then we'll look at the shoe, because if they're doing what they're doing, and I train all my athletes, I mean people barefoot or it's socks in the clinic. Yep. And you see it's the difference, because some of them come in these bulky shoes and they feel like they're balanced. They're using the support of that shoe. Right. Then you take them out and all of a sudden their foot's all over the place, So there's a big difference there. So I always improve the motor control first, and then we go and look at the shoe, and then we talk about, what type of shoe we're going to look at, because that's kind of a transition, So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely makes sense. And kind of sharing a similar, I guess, experiences. I just always kind of wondered, because it feels like the more often that I would go out and, you'd look for a pair of basketball sneakers to especially Under Armour brands. That's not me trying to throw that particular brand on the bus or anything, but a particular athlete they sponsor is Steph Curry, and he's had ankle injuries throughout his entire career. And so I've had a couple of pairs of Steph Curry's in my that I've played in, and you can genuinely tell the difference that they make in terms of the stability that they allow, or that they increase, I guess, at your ankle. It does make an absolute difference. And that like I said, that kind of segued into the question is if you're creating these sneakers that are just so I guess established to increase stability, I'm just curious what that would do. And I feel like while it might not be exactly transferable, and the brace kind of question itself doesn't particularly translate to footwear, the concept, at least to me, is a little bit similar, and so that's why I just thought it was a bit of an interesting kind of niche sort of topic.
Yeah, and we talked about this morning. If you start, all of a sudden you went from a low ankle sprain and you started bracing that to now a high ankle sprain, and now you're going to, go higher with a brace. Now you're going to have knee issues, right? Yep. Or it's the hip, or it's the next thing that's not braced.
Yeah.
But again, going back to my point, there's no motor control learning the patterns over again. Let's start there. If you need bracing for, the beginning, okay, that's great. But the goal is to wean you off of that as soon as possible and get the motor control and all those things back in gear.
Yeah.
To me, I never understood basketball shoes. I think they're stupid looking. I don't know what the point is. But if there's one thing I've learned, there's one thing I've learned about sponsorships throughout this whole OCR experience and all that. It's companies will come out with a product and they want to push that to get it in front. So what do? They look at an athlete that's really good, a lot of popularity. That's how Instagram blew up, and that's why everyone was so huge with followers. And now it doesn't even freaking matter anymore because Instagram changed their algorithm. Everybody wanted followers because if you have a lot of followers, then you got sponsors, and all these sponsors would approach. It could be like a fruit bar brand or something, But the thing is, these companies would come out and they would look at athletes that were seen a lot, and they'd want to get their product on them because they're seen a lot, even if the athlete didn't believe in the product. So these athletes get these products, and sometimes they'll promote them. And I find it funny where sometimes you see an athlete using a product and then it goes quiet and they're starting to use something else. It's that way of saying that I didn't really believe in it, you know? So same thing with pro athletes. You think those pro athletes, all of them drink Gatorade? I don't think so. If you're really taking care of yourself, you're not drinking Gatorade. You have a personal trainer, you have a sports nutritionist, you have all that. You think Tom Brady's drinking Gatorade? No, sorry. So all these guys that have these private trainers that are really taking care of them behind the scenes, they're doing all that stuff. But hey, Gatorade wants to throw me money to wear a towel and walk around with a drink. I'm going to take it. You're going to write me a check? Cool. You know, because they don't care, because that product is just getting seen in front, you know. So to answer the Steph Curry thing, I mean, they're just going to throw these products there, number one. Number two, a big thing that I've talked about with Joe, and this is one of the first conversations we had when we first met, is when you start getting on and you go to courses, like if you get a chance to go to like a Kevin Wilk course, or you get a chance, I could even send you, Ryan, some of the podcasts where you listen to the guys that work, personal trainers for pro athletes. They'll tell you that a lot of these guys don't know what they're doing. Just because they are a physical specimen doesn't mean they have any understanding about the human body, about performance. You know, they need guys to keep them on the right track. So the really good athletes are going to reach out with their agent and find a personal trainer somewhere, because in these systems, like you take the Eagles, for example, the NovaCare system, I don't know how well, you know, the trainers and stuff are in there. I don't know. But I know that when I've listened to trainers talk, some of them will say, look, you know, sometimes trainers will make their way into a position because they knew somebody. So maybe, you know, I don't know, like your neighbor knows somebody in the NovaCare complex and you want to intern there. So then you start going and interning, and then you build your way up, and before you know it, you have a job, you know, and then you just kind of work your way through. But then sometimes a lot of good trainers get their shot that way, but then a lot of good trainers don't get their shot, you know, because nobody knows they're around there, you know. So when you really talk to these guys that work with the pros, they're going to tell you that just because someone's working with the pros doesn't mean they're that good. And it's the ugly truth, you know. And I used to think that, oh, you work with the pros, you're invincible, you're all that. But it's not the case. A lot of these guys are not taking care of themselves the way they need to be. So somebody like Steph Curry getting repeated ankle sprains, what's going on there? Another example, Joel Embiid. Guy is 6 foot, 200-something pounds. I mean, he's like a lumbering oaf in those big shoes. He has no control of his feet. It's no wonder he has stress fractures. Yep. And the Sixers organization wants to be like, well, you know, we're going to do a controlled loading phase, and, you know, they're going to tease it along because they know the general population doesn't understand. It's inexcusable, because you look behind the scenes, you're going to look at a guy like that and say, he should not be doing this amount of volume of playing basketball. Can he even stand on one leg? Let's look at that first. So they should have taken him off, found those deficits, built them up, and then put him back. You know, I mean, you can see it all across the system. I mean, RG3 is the most viral example. You look at that guy's combine jump. All you got to do is Google RG3 jump with the valgus. I mean, it's incredible. No wonder he had an ACL, you know, a tear. And then
it's no wonder it took that long.
Well, yeah, how no one picked up on that. No one looked at that. And then, you know, when he came back from the rehab, they got him back too early and against James Andrews' advice, and he tore it again.
Yep.
You know, so these are things that, again, are unacceptable at that level. You know, so I mean, I'm kind of speaking a little bit from the perspective of hearing these guys who work with the pros give examples of talking stuff. I mean, there's a lot of other examples, but sometimes you have to look at that. Just because someone is at that top tier and they have all the spotlight doesn't mean that their path they get in there is always the healthiest and the best. You got to look a little bit, especially if they're always getting injured. That's a little bit of a red flag. You know, that shouldn't be happening, but sometimes they don't know any better. You know?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. But to add on the point of like a taping technique, so like an example would be sometimes too, we use the McConnell taping. So you have limited dorsiflexion. We do that posterior glide with the medial arch support to facilitate and help tape that ankle to produce that mobility. But it's not, let's just tape and let you go. It's we tape it, we hammer out mobility. And then once you're doing those mobility drills and you're trying to get that end range dorsiflexion, your body has to learn how to control that. So range of motion without motor control is pointless. Kelly Starr will tell you that. Ray Cook will tell you that. So that's why static stretching to me is stupid. And it took me a while to realize that. Doing all these hamstring stretches and stuff. And it's like, okay, but can your body take it there? What's the point of having that range of motion? It's like empty motion. So you need to have your body be able to bring it there. So that's why mobility is important. So we do the ankle mobility, then we do drills to facilitate the foot to be in that position. So we facilitate with like half kneel positions, lunging, split stance, deep squat. Once all that is there, that'll help reinforce that, because you could do towel stretches on your calf all you want. I mean, if you're an athlete, it's not going to help you, because when you're playing, there's no towel pulling your foot back. I have to learn how to control with my ankle at the closed chain dorsiflexion degrees here. And you'll see that where some of these athletes that Joe has sent, I can push their ankle back, looks really good off the table. But then when we go and load them, you see a big difference. And I have one right now that has a 10-degree difference. One, it moves and they go over the other one like, yeah, that hurts, it's painful, it feels stiff. But on the table, it looked really good. The joint acts differently when it's loaded, and the muscles have to contract and stabilize. There's something going on there. So you got to start looking at those two positions as well.
Gotcha. See this? Man, I just sit here and just got so much knowledge. This is so much fun.
Let them know.
Dude, this is good shit. There was another topic you were talking about. You were saying about the hamstring prevention programming.
Yeah. So one thing I've had the fortune of being exposed to a lot, especially during the quarantine these last couple of months, is just a generalized increase in terms of amount of information you can consume online. And one of the ways that that's kind of come about is just through the use of webinars. I'm sure both of you can attest. You've probably seen some stuff on LinkedIn or other social media platforms where people are putting out what would otherwise normally cost money or be conferences you'd have to attend in person. They're starting to become more widely available. And a couple weeks ago, I was actually able to listen in on a Sports Map Network webinar, and it was primarily discussing lower extremity soft tissue injuries, and the panel that they had of people on this webinar were just absolutely incredible. And one of my favorite presentations was given by a person named James Moore. Mike, I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but he's pretty influential, I guess, clinician in terms of his work with athletes. And one thing, he spoke particularly on a couple of case studies when it comes to hamstring injuries. And as he went through doing that, broke down anatomy, physiology, function, what it might be. And one thing in particular I thought was really interesting, and it's something that I hadn't considered, was how the adductor magnus actually should be considered the fifth influential muscle, especially when you're considering the proximal MTJ or musculotendinous junction of the hamstring itself. It's, like I said, something that if you kind of think about in terms of its anatomical orientation, it inserts at that area. And it's one of the most influential hip extensors in a period of hip flexion, which, like I said, like if you go and you think about just the function of the muscle itself, it would make sense. But again, just something that I had never really considered personally. And if given the fact that proximal segment is what's most often injured, especially in high-speed running injuries at the hamstring, you can probably venture to guess that it could be related to a lack of eccentric strength at times, right? I'm sure some of us are familiar with the fact that a lot of times those that are that injure their hamstrings or have frequent hamstring injuries could be due to a lack of eccentric control during those periods of the late swing phase, especially when you're running at high speeds. But it could also be due to inefficiency of synergy or contribution of muscles that actually support the hamstrings. And that was, again, his idea that was presented. I thought was an absolutely great idea. And given that they work to help to create some of those hip extensor moments at high speeds, it just I thought was a really good take-home point. That's just to illustrate, it's something at least for me to consider if you're working with an athlete that could either be frequently re-injuring their hamstrings or could be, I guess, at risk to injure their hamstrings, which is a segue to something else that I was meaning to bring up too. I guess we can get to in a sec. But for those that are more at risk, if you're creating an athlete profile, right, it would make sense to also monitor adductor strength. And I think that's something that sometimes, from my understanding of his presentation, it wasn't always considered. Thought it was a really good point. And relatively, I don't want to say easy to program for, but it's something that we can consider in terms of strength and conditioning professionals, post-rehab specialists, rehabilitative specialists, whatever our title might be. For those of us working with athletes, I think it does, carry merit to actually consider. And I thought that was a really good point. Again, I'm just curious your opinion on it too.
So what you're going to start to see too with this is, I think even coming out of school, being like a new PT, we tend to get fixated on single muscle group stuff. It was like when the whole VMO craze, and there's still therapists that still do straight leg raises with a little bit of external rotation in the leg. They're just, it's mind blowing, but that's what they do. So great. You want to have them do leg raises, knock yourself out. You know, I mean, this is where it's going to come down to our profession progressing because, you know, especially during this whole COVID time, you're going to see other professions starting to really bump themselves up. They're going to promote themselves through videos, through virtual stuff. I mean, everyone's going to do it. So you have more access to the information. So people are going to start looking here. There's going to be any trainer on Instagram could put up videos and stuff like that. And people say, oh, I saw this, I saw that, you know. So they're going to see all these ideas. And the thing is like, there's a million exercises out there. There's so many ways to do stuff. So as a PT, it could be really overwhelming, or even in Joe's case, the trainer, you see all this cool stuff and you want to do it and you see like really like high level, low level, like what do you do? And it's like when you start to see the individual and the deficits, you're going to start to learn like what to do with them. And then you'll come up with your own ideas. And it's like, you can do whatever you want. And that's a great thing with like functional movement systems. Great Cook and those guys give ideas of correctives. But if you understand the concept of what you're trying to do, you could be as creative as possible. So
Right.
people used to think FMS was just like an exercise party. And I used to laugh and say, no. I was like, you know, you could do all the manual you want. Manual is very important as PTs. But if you do adjustments, you do soft tissue work, and that person comes off the table and they're loading themselves like a jerk, it's going to go right back again. So you have to make sure that the exercises are complementing the manual stuff that you're doing.
Right.
You know, so it has to be both. Or you can't just skip manual and just do exercise. If someone's trying to exercise through joint mobility restriction or soft tissue, they're not going to get anywhere, you know. So you look at an adductor muscle, for example. So if you're someone competing and you're like a bodybuilder, you're going to sit there and do all these squeezes, all these crazy stuff. I mean, they hit everything at a million different angles. They're in the gym for 2 hours. Their performance is physique. If you're looking at performance as an athlete, you're going to start noticing that these muscles don't need to be completely isolated. They need to learn to work together. You know, there's a difference between doing long arm quad versus like closed kinetic chain loading. This athlete is performing in positions. When are they ever sitting, straightening their leg? That has its place, like especially if it's like post-op where there's really, really like deficient like quad asymmetry, you know, like I know Kevin Wilk will do a lot of that. He'll do some isolated stuff to get it to catch up, but he's always implementing that like perturbation and closed kinetic chain. I mean, if you look at his like Instagram, you'll see does a lot of single leg perturbations, bands, and all this stuff to really get the body to react to all these external stimuli, because that's what's going on. When Joe gets a chance to work with like some of the athletes at a little more high level, and he does things where they're going to get a ball and he bounces them with a Swiss ball. What happens if a player twice your size come and hits you? These girls and these guys have to be able to stabilize their core, brace, and land and all that. So you're going to look at these corrective exercises they're going to start doing that will engage that adductor with other movements. So you start doing things where if you're doing a lateral movement, you have to realize that the leg, so if I'm going lateral lunge to my right, let's look at where that left leg is stabilizing, because if you have it in the right stability position, the adductor, the hamstrings, the glutes, and the pelvis are stabilizing that leg so they're all working together, translating. Same thing when you're doing any type of like lunge position. Look at what the stance leg is doing and transferring the patterns. Everything's working together. Instead of just sitting and doing like, you know, ball squeezes and stuff like that, you're starting to get the muscles to work synergistically to get a better movement pattern. And then before you know it, everything works together, and then you start seeing that. But you're right, you could see like adductor strains and stuff because maybe there is deficiency and something is compensating somewhere. But when you train everything to work together, all of a sudden you'll see those things start dissipating out.
Did you see the, I sent you a video right before we got on. I said to you, I'm not really sure if I just made this video, this exercise up, but it was something that Ryan and I had talked about, this question, which prompted the whole podcast in the first place. It shows the athlete, right? You can see, are you watching it now?
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Now, that's definitely a good creative idea. It's almost kind of like a little bit of a modified, almost like a bear crawl position, mountain climber position, getting to stimulate that adductor, and then you're doing an abduction movement, so he's learning to stabilize. Now, if he learns to feel for that proprioception in the hip and core. And now you can translate that to more aggressive bear crawl, lateral bear crawls, or then getting to do more lateral movements and standing. But sometimes you need to do a couple of these basic things so the person learns awareness of their body, and then can they take that same feeling and translate that? Just like with the girl we were talking about earlier, Ryan, he had a girl had doing lateral lunges, and when she would go to lunge, she would hyperextend her back. So anterior pelvic tilt, when she's going into the squat, a lot of it lumbar lordosis there. So she's not really engaging her core and getting those glutes. So we got her, sometimes might have to duck back, and we could do like a wall sit, lean up against the wall, suck your belly in, and do a pelvic engagement there to learn to get out of that anterior pelvic tilt. Feel for what that feels like. Yeah. Then let's take that same feeling and try to translate that into a lateral lunge. Or you might have to manually cue her. When she goes to lunge, put your hands on her pelvis and cue her and position her. I got to do that with patients all the time. You know, they walk around, especially the worst are gymnasts. Gymnasts, duck butt central because of all the back hooks and hamstrings. It's really, it's bad. Then you get the, spondylolisthesis, all that stuff. That's usually something that you got to look at in the young girls when they're doing gymnastics real early, being aware of that. Because, I mean, that's part of where you're going to see some sacrifice in mobility, stability type changes. Eric Cressy talks about that. Baseball players, they're going to have an abnormal arm. That's just part of the sport, you know. Right. Quarterbacks, same thing with gymnasts. You want to be a gymnast, you're going to have hypermobility in certain areas, but are you stable? Can you stabilize that position? Or are we just crashing down on lumbar segments when we're doing movements? Or are we moving into a very excessive lumbar component, but we're having the muscle stabilize there? Great example is high-level Olympic gymnast doing an iron cross, and he's got his legs straight out. He's not really using his core. He's using his hip flexors and his back extensors to hold that position. Looks good, but it's really not. So now when you break it down, you look at that, you got to retrain that motor control pattern. Otherwise, he's going to blow his back out or get like a hernia or something, you know? So sometimes things look good, but they're not.
Right. And I came up with that. Basically, we were talking about, you know, trying to isolate the adductor a little bit. And we talked about Copenhagen's. And I didn't want to do a straight leg there because, A, the leg that was bent in that video, that's the operative knee on the ACL. And he had a hamstring graft. And he was the one I talked to you about yesterday. So I didn't want to put the knee in that type of extension there. In unsupported. So I went with, so that's where I kind of got creative with the idea there. But so that makes sense then. That could be kind of like a precursor to, like you said, a lateral bear crawl or even a bear crawl in itself.
Yeah. I mean, then also the proximal hamstring stuff is really good. So if you have them lie on their back and they have their feet in like a TRX cable and they're doing the extensions out, but the biggest thing is to make sure they're not hyperextending their back, maintaining, a neutral pelvis, making sure they have that as they straighten the legs and as they pull back in and they're not, anterior tilting that pelvis. So making sure they're doing it right, or same thing you do with a Swiss ball or the sliders, the furniture sliders. Yep. Another good one is Chris Knott, who is a personal trainer for a lot of the NFL guys, talks about the basically the glute ham drop, where you're kneeling and you slowly drop yourself down. But what he does is he has them kneeling and they anchor their feet under a bar. Someone holds it. Then they have one of those pull-up assist bands tied to the pull-up bar above, and they hold it behind their head. And they slowly lower themselves down. So the band, it's like an assisted pull-up. Right. Make them lower down. They're maintaining the pelvic position, go down as far as they can, and then they got to pull themselves back up. So a lot of the players can do just the eccentric part, but they can't contract and pull themselves back up. So that's like an assisted kind of pull-up. Using the band to do the movement, same thing. Learning to engage that proximal hamstring is making you aware of your core and your pelvis. And that proximal work is really important for stabilizing the pelvis. Everyone wants to do hamstring curls and getting a lot in the distal hamstring, was the proximal that you see a problem. And proximal hamstring tendinopathy, literally a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
When you get an athlete with that, you got to get in there and you got to dig at that ischial tube. And it is not, you got people's legs up and you're digging in there and you're trying to break things down. It's not great. Guys and girls, you're literally digging in their ass. It's not great. So the point case, don't get proximal hamstring tendinopathy.
I won't say his name, but I know one of my buddies does listen. He called me the other day. He's like, dude, I think I pulled my hamstring playing softball. He's like, it's right up underneath my ass cheek. I'm like, yeah, that's typically where that's going to happen playing softball. You haven't done anything in forever. And then it gets better. I talked to him yesterday to see how he was doing. He said, oh, I went for a light run this morning.
Nice.
I said, well, that ought to warm it right up. Either that or snap it, one or the other.
Yeah, seriously.
So, go ahead, Ron.
One point I did want to make, and I thought that the points that you're making, Mike, about like synergistic patterns, you know, is important to consider a whole unit of muscles working together in terms of their influence. I think that's true, and especially with this, I think that it's a part of that unit itself, from at least from my understanding of it, that's not often considered, but still, I guess, functionally does impact, especially at periods of you know, higher, you know, or maximal velocity sprinting, does offer influence in terms of its you know, ability to aid in hip extension. And so if you're going to, you know, introduce this you know, athletes, you know, to this form of running with an inherently weaker subdivision of that group itself, I do think that could actually help to create an influence in terms of you know, a risk of injury, right? That could be modifiable, and it's something that often isn't considered as much, even though functionally it does act to aid periods of you know, hip extension while we're running. And part of what he did mention was just to consider these synergistic patterns as we, you know, try to load these athletes, right? And that doesn't just, you know, fall suit to the, you know, adductor magnus itself. That includes, you know, periodic loading of the hip flexors, the abdominals, and the adductors in positions that would help to influence you know, positions that we'd be running in. So, you know, one of them that I talked to Joe about earlier was doing like a modified Copenhagen, where you're essentially doing like an ISO hold while also working on core stability and trunk rotation in a period where you're not exactly doing a Copenhagen, but it's something that looks similar to it, and you're getting an isometric contraction, which would be strengthening your adductor itself. That shouldn't be the be-all end-all that you would consider as you go to program for an athlete, but it could be a section of their athletic profile that if they have values that would decrease, might say, okay, they might still be lacking in terms of their ability to dissipate force in periods of hip extension. That would actually be an area to consider as a subset, in addition to your typical eccentric programming for your hamstrings, right? So I think that what would offer, I guess, merit would be including this as a group to try and consider training, because it can't help, and it could just increase resiliency, especially during those periods of you know, knee extension, where you're increasing your eccentric, you know, force on your hamstrings as you run. And you know, that on top of introducing to an increased amount of load in terms of the velocity you'd be running at, you know, and that introduction to help people to get used to that kind of position. Do that on top of training, you know, train the hamstrings, the entire posterior chain for that matter, in addition to their core, their hip flexors, and their adductors. I just thought you know, the point itself as an additional muscle that from what it may seem might not often as, you know, be considered, and I can recognize that given my position, I still wouldn't hold too much of, you know, myself accountable, given the fact that I haven't treated it too often. But like I said, it just seems like an interesting, you know, just an add-on that isn't often considered as much. And I think that if you were to still try and work, understanding that this unit is all, you know, an influencer of one another, it definitely would be something that I think would be worth considering at times. So I thought it was pretty interesting.
Mike, would you ever do that or use that in early stage ACL rehab, using some of the isolated adductor magnus type stuff that Ryan's talking about, exercises?
I do some of that. Like, I'll do some of the like squeezes and engagement just for the pelvic stability with bridging, especially also for like core engagement. So I have them get in a plank position or even a side plank position. They got to squeeze a ball between there because that helps to stabilize the pelvis. It also helps them to cue to squeeze their glutes together to get that to stabilize the pelvis. People tend to forget that the glute max is the biggest, you know, muscle in the human body. And, you know, humans are the only mammal that has the biggest glute max. It's because we're the only mammal that is bipedal. So that's for a reason. Other mammals are on 4 legs, and other mammals might be able to run faster than we can for short periods, but they can't outrun us. That's where that whole primitive pattern comes from, is humans can basically outrun their food. So if you had to track something down, that's why we can run for 26 miles. There's no animal that runs that. Like wolves will migrate for miles, but they're not running the whole time. So that glute max is important, and sometimes it's just not engaged. And, Brett Contreras will talk about this really well, the glute guy, says some people, especially women, genetically have nice butts, but they're not muscular. And it's true.
Right.
So he exposes it all the time, and he's right. You get these girls that genetically have a nice butt, and they go on and they do some bullshit exercises, and everyone wants to follow them, and they have a great following. And it's like the exercises they're doing are trash, and he exposes that all the time. Yep. So you got to look at like the purity of it. So we got to remember that it's about the efficiency of the exercise. So
good point.
Yeah, to answer the question, I'll do some of those exercises because again, you're using that, and like I kind of follow that FMS system where we start with an unloaded position. The less loaded, the less external stimulus the body has to worry about. So you start supine, quadruped, then you progress to tall kneel, half kneel, going from there, and then you start working. So same thing, we do pail-off presses. I have them squeeze a ball so they can learn on engaging, tucking the pelvis down, stabilizing that whole co-contraction as they press out, so they get aware of what that looks like. And the goal is to get them off of the bands and the ball and to be able to do that. Yep. So yeah, I think I'll implement some of that adductor stuff. But I don't have them do like, seated in a chair, ball squeezes and stuff. I think I do that a little bit more for geriatric, because for them, I'm just trying to get them moved, trying to get them something. And they're exhausted after 10, so then they got to go to the bathroom. So
yeah, I think just integrating like these positions that are more, I guess, like sports specific or functionally relevant is something that I shouldn't say might. It absolutely is something to consider. It's important, and I just think that's a good point, to be honest with you. So,
dude,
I'm here. Oh, my bad, Joe.
Yeah.
Oh, you sure?
Yeah.
I was kind of a segue. I was going to ask what both of your opinions are on the idea of injury prevention as a term.
So injury prevention, so you'll hear that from anybody in rehab profession. We use that kind of loosely, but you can't really prevent an injury. It's more about reduction of almost, I guess, severity and risk. So basically, take an athlete that's really stable. They land really bad on one leg. Instead of an ACL tear, they get maybe a little MCL sprain, maybe a little bit of soft tissue strain because the muscles took the blow, not the joint. So that's the difference between that could have been an ACL, but it's not. Or someone really stable on an ankle. I can tell you right now, I'll be running, I'll roll my ankle, and it snaps right back. That's just from training. I even did that in high school. I've actually seen that with even non-athletic people. I remember one woman specifically, really bad ankle instability. She was probably in her 40s. She would just go walk into the mall. The ankle would just roll on her. We worked on her for like 8 weeks probably, doing the stuff. She was religious with the stuff. Then she would say she literally walked, the ankle would go like this and would snap right back because she has the motor control. So could have been a bad injury, but now it's minor. So the kid that landed and took a soft tissue strain, your muscles are meant to take that blow, versus a kid who lands and just completely destroys his knee. But then that's barring non-contact. If someone slide tackles you and breaks your ankle, like something that happened to me when I was in high school, It is what it is. It is. Right. You take a helmet to the knee. I mean, when I see those linemen rolling around in a bad pileup in like an NFL game, I'm like, oh my God, these guys are falling all over the place. I'm like, Jesus.
Yeah. No, I actually think that's a really good way to put it. And I was speaking with a close friend recently, and he offered that like the term injury prevention itself is a bit of a flare term, right? Because as a technicality, you can't ever actually prevent injury, as you were saying. Like random things might happen that you can't plan for. So a better way to term it might actually be to call it like injury resilience or injury mitigation, because like I said, you can't actually prevent the injury itself. But if you followed it with the same frame of mind of you can, train people much in the same way as you would create a strength and conditioning prevention or program to make them more resilient to tolerate increases in load, it will be the same thing with designing a program to make these athletes more resilient to when these faulty patterns or these unfortunate consequences of the movements that they're performing happen, to be able to better respond to it, to decrease the severity or to decrease the percent chance that they might have of actually experiencing these injuries. And I thought that was a really, really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Because I think for, again, and this is where I, catch myself, at least from my understanding sometimes, and I'd be guilty of it, is that you get too caught up in trying to, compare A to equal to B and take this like linear approach almost, that because there might be one risk factor that you could target, to assume that will always create some sort of, faulty injury or an unfortunate consequence. And so you'd want to train that without understanding that these, systems have a tendency to kind of interact with one another more so than just to approach something from a tunnel vision viewpoint, if that makes sense.
Well, I'd say first thing is I'm always trying to prevent injuries from happening, right? But
yep.
I mean, that's goal number one in the strength training program, is to make sure that you're not hurting them, right?
Yep.
But again, I have an ACL injury reduction program
exactly
that I offer to people, right? And what I tell them is, I don't guarantee that it's going to stop the ACL from tearing, but what I can guarantee is that if you don't do this, you're at a higher risk of tearing it.
Perfect way to word it. Exactly.
So
perfect way to word it.
What I would say is, Kelly Stark talks about this too. Kelly Stark is a great example, I think, in that Supple Leopard book, and everybody loves to flip through the exercises and all the cool stuff, but the beginning chapter is probably the most important. He talks about the background of understanding basically how the human body works and all that type of stuff. So he talks about open loop and closed loop systems. So,
right.
An open loop, you have a position where there's almost kind of, there's a hole and you're skipping over it. And athletes, the more talented the athlete, the higher the compensation, because they could just kind of skip through stuff. They have speed, they have size, they have power, they're genetically built to do that. So they'll skip over certain things, and that's where the injuries will happen. So what happens is, if you're training and you're compensating in your training just to get it done, that's where you're going to pose a high risk of injury, because you're training these faulty patterns. So if you are training and you're focusing more on the quality of the training instead of just the numbers of the time and all that, then you could get away with compensation, because that's always going to happen in competition.
Right.
You're always going to compensate a little bit. But if you've trained right 9 out of 10 of the times, and that 10 out of 10, you'll get away with doing something a little weird,
Yep. Good point.
And you could hear this too from, any strength conditioning coaches, even in the NFL. They talk about that. They'll tell you that guys like to talk about, we got 10 guys who could power clean X amount of weight. Well, that's great. No one gives a shit when you're 2 and 10. So what's happening is these guys are compensating to get that weight. So they're not actually training the muscles under that duress. So when it comes time to translating that onto the field, they're not hitting that point. So then the injury happens, or they break down, because when it came time to actually train those muscles, they're not doing it because they're compensating. So they're not getting that specificity in. So is that training, again, speaking the language of your sport? Is it translating over? Which also ties into another good point, is a part of the injury thing is there are other factors that contribute to it. Greg Cook talks about that also, is you have the mobility, you have the stability, you have the fundamental capacity, everything's in place. What about other factors? Central nervous system stress. You're overtraining. You're pounding yourself down, and you want to go and you want to compete, and your body is just not having it. It's not there. Stress, other things that are going on in the lifestyle that can affect that. And that's really big, especially with the high school sports, because, even though these kids can, we talk about as you get a little bit older, sometimes you can't handle as much volume and things like that. Sometimes the younger kids, like a 20-year-old, could go and do like 5 workouts a day. But what I think I've heard them starting to talk about in terms of other like trainers and even research is that some of that carryover isn't specific. So you're doing 5 workouts a day, but how much is that really carrying over? And when you're kind of younger, that carryover is a little bit minimal. So it's more about the quality of the workout. Let's do maybe 1 or 2 quality workouts, absorb that instead of just doing everything because you have the energy to do it. Just like when you get into your 30s and 40s, you don't have time to do 5 workouts a day. So it's really kind of a quality workout.
I do.
Getting stuff from that workout.
There we go.
What?
I said, I do. I have plenty of time to get in 5 workouts a day.
Pool sprints, we're into plyo.
Hey, listen, I'm no more going to the pool clearly, right?
Well, ladies,
Listen, Mike, I've been diligent. I've been getting in my workouts. Ryan saw me this morning.
He was in there this morning.
I got my workout. I had to cut him off because I didn't want to talk to him anymore. I said, we'll save it for the podcast. I got to get my workout in. But I'm looking at the time. I don't mean to cut Ryan off, but this way we can get him back on with some other questions down the road.
So there we go. I'll save the one I was going to ask next.
I still got to speed home and eat. And then we got a late night podcast with our boy from the West Coast, Mr. Smooth, with his headphones and his microphone and everything. Like, I sit there and I watch him. I just feel like I'm at home just watching him just do his thing, and he's talking. He's got the smooth California voice. Yeah, he's a good dude. But before we get off, I always like to make sure that people know where to find you. So, Ryan, where can we find you?
Sure. Right now, my two primary areas I'd say to look me up on would be one, Twitter. I gave a little shameless plug to my Twitter earlier today. It's at pt_tags. My second one would be if anyone has LinkedIn. I'm pretty big. No, I shouldn't say I'm pretty big. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Ryan Tagliamonte, SPT. Those would be the two main ones. Other than that, that's probably where you'd find me on social media at the moment. I told you today I'm working on trying to get an actual professional Instagram page, going through some exercises and things that I think that are pretty relevant and worth mentioning that, people could do. That'll come in time, but for the moment, those two will probably be the best.
Bingo. Michael, where can they find you?
I'm most active on Instagram, good at icor_St. George. So you could see all the fabulous OCR workouts, some comedy, and then you get some PT related stuff. It's a mix of everything. Try to keep it entertaining. Yes,
it is. His stories are quite entertaining. Quite entertaining, yes.
They don't put those filters on there for no reason, man. People need to start having some fun. Stop being so serious.
You got to follow my man, icor_St. George, definitely. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube. I'm all over the place right now.
Social media menace.
I'm trying to get hot on one of them, but you can find me mainly on Instagram at Coach_Haas, HOS. Guys, I appreciate it. Michael, I'll see you in a little bit. Ryan, I'll probably see you either tomorrow or next week.
Yes, sir.
All right, buddy. Thanks for being on.
I appreciate it a lot, guys. I really enjoyed myself today, so thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. I'm always learning with you guys, so thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Michael, I'll see you soon.
All right.